Obviously, the Iranians were not, at least the revolutionary government when it came to power, was hesitant and was kind of afraid that again there would be a coup similar to 1953 traveling of Dr. Mossadegh, the first kind of a democratically elected prime minister in Iran that was toppled by a coup. That now the documents of that is being released, including this year, a whole bunch of documents from secret files of CIA were released. But in reality, that caused a resentment from the Iranians to accept any friendly hands from U.S. And the bottom line was that there was the occupation of U.S. embassy in Tehran for a year. And so from that on, has always been animosities between the two countries. But many times Iranian governments have put forward a solution or a suggestion for what they call a great bargain to resolve all the problems. But the American side obviously never wanted to accept those offers, and it was always a benefit the American military industry to have an animosity with somebody in that region, because there are oils, there are kingdoms, there are all sheikdoms in Persian Gulf that they have to somehow spend their money, and that's the best way of selling weapons to that region. They are purchasing in astronomical numbers. There was this autonomous government in the northern Iraq, the Kurdish regional government that has been in power since 1992, actually. After the first Iraq war, George Bush the father granted that autonomy to them, and there was a northern no-fly zone in Iraq, so Iraqis could not approach the Kurdish area. They are planning to somehow provide that buffer zone on the north. Why? Because then it connects, basically, it brings Israel to become a neighbor of Islamic Republic of Iran, similarly to the Hezbollah in Lebanon that is now a neighbor of Israel. So these are basically tic-for-toe, and the situation is getting tougher and tougher. The reason, and another part of it is that, again, with what Marty was saying about North Korea, somebody signs an agreement, the next president doesn't follow. And so they are expecting the other side to always be accepting the terms. So there was this agreement between Obama and the five UN Security Council member plus Germany, and everybody now says that Iran is following all the accord, and then all of a sudden Trump doesn't like it. It was the worst agreement that the U.S. has ever signed in the history, and it was a blowout to Mr. Trump. What was given to Iran after that? U.S. totally blocked any commitment that was given in that agreement. It's called JCPOA, or publicly known as Iran deal. Part of it is, it was supposed to be lifting of all the sanctions that were imposed on Iran. Now they say, well, Iran did not commit to the spirit of the Iran deal. The spirit of it is not threats that Mr. Trump, day and night, with tweet, without tweet, with anything, throws out. But the Iranian spirit is that they have to be subservient to the American hegemony in the region.
In the year 2014, the Obama administration, with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State and Victoria Nuland as her assistant, took part in sponsoring a violent coup of the democratically elected Ukrainian government of Viktor Yanukovych. In its place, they installed a bona fide neo-fascist government that had direct ties to the Nazis of World War II Germany. The eastern part of the Ukraine, known as the Crimea, has always been ethnically about 90% Russian and didn't react favorably to the new state of affairs, as there were already threats of ethnic cleansing of Russians emanating from the new fascist regime in Kiev. Russia already had 20,000 troops stationed in the Crimea at their naval base on the Black Sea, so it was understandable that this would be viewed by Vladimir Putin as a direct threat and an extreme provocation. In this state of emergency, a voting plebiscite was conducted, and 90% of the Crimean population voted to secede from the illegitimate government in Ukraine and reunite with Russia, a country which it had historically been part of for centuries. One of the principal goals of the U.S. planners of the coup was to make Ukraine a member of NATO. For the last 20 years, there's been an ongoing campaign to expand the boundaries of NATO to the point that it now includes 25 countries and is literally surrounding the borders of Russia. Can anyone doubt that if the situation was reversed and Russia was conducting regime change operations in Canada or Mexico and building a military alliance around U.S. borders, that it would be tolerated? But that is precisely what is happening all around Russia, and particularly in the Middle East, where what started with Afghanistan and Iraq is now morphing into Libya and Syria. The U.S. intervention into Syria was ostensibly about fighting ISIS, which had been created out of the chaotic ruins of the disastrous invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Syria is a more complicated conflict because while the U.S., Syria, and Russia are all fighting ISIS, the U.S. really wants regime change in Damascus, like they have imposed everywhere else. Since Syria has been a close ally of Russia for decades, Putin has basically drawn a line in the sand and said no. There's a principle of sovereignty that must be respected by all nations, including the U.S. For the first time, a world leader is standing in the way of American goals for hegemony in the region, and that is a major reason why Russia is now being made into the new enemy. In July of 2016, the U.S. presidential campaign was in full swing, and there was suddenly a release of thousands of emails by WikiLeaks. It came from the Democratic National Committee and John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. The two primary revelations in the emails were, one, how the DNC and the Clinton campaign had essentially plotted to sabotage the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, and two, the content of the speeches that Hillary gave to Goldman Sachs, for which she was paid $675,000, and which confirmed that she was a servant of their interest. Arguably, this information was crucial for the public to know, but the mainstream media just ignored it. The release of these emails was the genesis of a plan launched by the DNC and the Clinton campaign to create a preemptive cover story that was designed to discredit the leaks and divert attention from the substance of the leaks. The result would be a wholly fabricated narrative that would claim it was the Russian government under the direction of Putin and with the collusion of the Trump campaign that orchestrated the hacking of the DNC computers and illegally stole the information. The purpose was to hurt Hillary's campaign and to help Trump win the election. It wasn't just Clinton and the Democrats who were invested in demonizing the Russians. Wall Street, the CIA, the War Party, and the mainstream media were on the same page, and they particularly wanted to punish the Russians for blocking their plans for regime change in Syria and thwarting U.S. plans to advance global hegemony in the Middle East and beyond. Hillary was the preferred choice of the ruling elites because she was viewed as a much more reliable and capable servant of their interests than the upstart Donald Trump. During the campaign, Trump was actually running to the left of Hillary on foreign policy. While Hillary was calling him a tool of the Kremlin, he was saying that it would be a good thing if we got along with Russia. Unlike Hillary, he was scathingly condemning the Iraq War that Hillary had been so instrumental in supporting. In fact, his isolationist anti-war positions were the reasons why many people who had been negatively affected by recent wars voted for him. Now, of course, they have become cruelly disappointed at his transformation into a neocon. The Russian email hacking accusation became the basis for one of the biggest disinformation campaigns in the history of American politics. For more than a year now, the mainstream media has been reporting the story as if it is an absolute fact. After this and an ongoing sham of an investigation, they have not produced one single shred of evidence to prove any of the charges. The reason is there is no evidence is quite simply the charges are a total fabrication. a completely fraudulent claim comparable in many ways to the entirely fictitious WMDs that were sold to the public as a pretext to attack Iraq. In fact, evidence has surfaced that disproves the allegations, but is being ignored by the mainstream media. The most disturbing outcome of all this is that those who have peddled this lie have succeeded in making the world a much more dangerous place. Russia has been made into the new archenemy that the war party needed to justify the next chapter in their never-ending war on the rest of the world. Now that Putin has been thoroughly demonized and Trump delegitimized and transformed into a neocon, the prospect for a miscalculation in Ukraine, Syria, Iran, or North Korea have exponentially increased. It is entirely possible that Trump would have pursued a belligerent foreign policy anyway. But the propaganda campaign to convict Russia of interfering in our democracy certainly ensured that he would have no choice. The U.S. Congress added insult to injury by passing a very reactionary sanctions bill targeting Russia, Iran, and North Korea with barely any dissenting votes from either party. And if that wasn't enough, the original charge of hacking continues to be evidence-free, but the propaganda smear machine keeps inventing new Russian transgressions, such as buying advertising time on Facebook with the purpose of influencing Americans' attitudes. The campaign has become so hysterical and unhinged that it seems as if we're living in some kind of political science fiction movie. And of course, all the accusations are grossly hypocritical, considering that the U.S. is far and away the leader in interfering in the affairs of other countries and even overthrowing democratically elected governments. It says something about the Democratic Party and many self-identifying liberals that they are willing to risk the survival of the planet to advance a false narrative that puts the two biggest nuclear superpowers on a potential collision course. But what this election and its aftermath have proven is that the U.S. is a regime, and that it is governed by a deep state which consists of corporate elites and a permanent war machine which remains in power regardless of who wins the election. Any candidates who threaten the regime, either from the anti-imperialist left or the isolationist libertarian right, are going to be subject to a relentless smear campaign. The purpose of all this is to delegitimize the election and to threaten Donald Trump with impeachment if he doesn't fall into line. And it appears to be working.
I'm here to talk about street wars. The Trump administration is aware at some level that it lost the popular vote and that it now must rule as a minority in the style of the de Klerk apartheid regime. To that end, Trump regularly gives dog whistle statements and gestures, the wall, banning Muslims and transgender people, sending Pence to a football game, and worse. Police departments across the nation have reacted with delight and enthusiasm at the election of Trump, and they have now formed a de facto fighting bloc with Klan and Nazi alt-right types. Now, that's a hell of a statement, but I'm going to back it up. So I want you to have no doubt. We are facing dangerous times in the streets and in our homes and workplaces. The fascist turn is too deeply rooted to be a mere fad. Part of the gaslighting strategy used by the alt-right is to claim that their free speech rights are being denied. And the fact is, no one has denied them the extraordinary spotlight and coverage they've received over the past few years, and especially in the last few months. What people object to is the imposition of an armed, blooded death squad on the podium, posing as an innocent purveyor of ideology. This denial is essential both to the maintenance of various aspects of American hierarchy, namely whiteness and patriarchy, and to the continued efforts by these armed and deadly groups to gain political traction. Now, I have to explain this because people like me and people of color and other targeted groups cannot afford to pretend that a public appearance by murderers is just a free speech event. Free speech, I think we'll agree, is the exchange of ideas between approximate equals, or at least between people who are not threatening each other. Meta statements threatening murder and dismemberment are not. And that's what you get with the Klan and the Nazis and the alt-right. Universities and civic groups should never pay to allow armed militias and death squads to pose on their platforms. So no Nazis, Klan types, or white supremacists are welcome on this podium today. Returning to the efforts of the current POTUS to divide the nation on racial and anti-GPLTQ grounds, courts are fighting back to some extent, but Trump has an ace up his sleeve. He can start new wars. most notably and immediately with North Korea and Iran. So cast your mind back to Japanese internment during the 40s and the insane paranoia of September 2001, and imagine for a moment that the juggernaut of fascism, what's going to come down on us. The Intercept, let's come up to this year. Last year, 14 officers in the San Francisco Police Department were caught exchanging racist and homophobic texts that include several references to white power and messages such as all N-words must effing hang. Most of those officers remain on the force after an attempt to fire several of them was blocked by a judge who said the statute of limitations had expired. Locally, recently, to settle a legal claim, the city of Portland has agreed to pay $5,000 to Portland Police Captain Mark Kruger in erase 2 disciplinary actions from his personnel records, including a suspension for his public tribute to 5 Nazi-era German soldiers at a city park. Kruger was well known for putting on a Nazi uniform when he felt like it. One of the cops slain by Michael Xavier Johnson in his rampage a few months ago in Dallas died with a white supremacist symbol tattooed on his ring finger, and post-Trump, it only gets worse. Remember that within the last couple of weeks, we have had the scene here in Portland of peaceful protesters being hooded and earmuffed in clear visual reference to Guantanamo in an effort to terrorize them and to terrorize all of you with the thought that your dissent is now so criminal that it is equivalent to the people who have been shoved into Guantanamo to be tortured so long and to have so little access to any sort of recourse that they're not even allowed to die. The worst hell that can possibly be imagined. This gesture came from the Portland Police working with Department of Homeland Security and after a visit by Jeff Sessions. Remember that constant inaction by the courts and whitewashing by the media of cop violence is organized and ideologically racist. It's not a mistake, and it's never, given the context, an exception. Remember that the Portland police were assisted in arresting anti-fascist protesters by a man named Todd Kelsey, who's a member of the American Freedom Keepers, a right-wing militia. According to The Intercept, Kelsey had been boasting of his relationship with the police earlier in the day. He said, "All I have to do is snap my fingers and the cops will arrest you." Remember that the Max murderer was allowed to finish his beer before he was arrested. Remember that the rifle-toting Malheur occupiers were treated with patience and kid gloves. It's not a fluke. It's white power. Regarding Antifa, I want to point out that they are a last defense and very necessary simply because of the absence of responsibility that I've just described. The police will not protect you from the alt-right because they are the alt-right. Reject the false equivalency that Trump promotes. Antifa is here because there is no reliable official guard against white terrorism. So now the question is what to do about it. We can do something about it. Understand race well enough to talk about it openly. When I say that, I'm speaking to white people. But I also say read the feminist writers, analyze the class divide, understand capitalism, which is not just economic activity, it's the oppression of the worker to extract and hoard value. The ignorance of all of these forms of oppression is grist for the mill for the alt-right. But the deliberate and cultural ignorance of white supremacy is the flying wedge for the street wars. People who are oppressed by whiteness know the system very well. A continuing hegemony of whiteness very much depends on pretending that whiteness does not confer constant benefits. The whole concept of race is blurry enough to be scientifically fraudulent, but that doesn't mean it isn't useful to the hierarchy, to the political and economic elites who rule us all by dividing us. Richard Spencer, I mentioned before, is touring the country's universities right now, taking advantage of the fact that white people don't want to look at what whiteness is. So here's a hint. It's so fraudulent that it doesn't even qualify under the questionable definitions of race. Whiteness is a system of oppression, not a race. I'm bringing up race. I'm bringing this because we need tools to fight back. The alt-right spends all kinds of energy on race, and in order to dig up excuses for maintaining whiteness, we must be more organized and energetic in understanding and deconstructing it. We will all be liberated, and most especially white people, not most especially, let me rephrase that, white people will also be liberated by destroying whiteness. These categories called race are in practice mixtures of superficial behavior and appearance, and whiteness is the concept of a superior race. Why do the alt-right say they want a white homeland? Because they think they are superior and that their superiority requires a genetic purity, which, as I just pointed out, is entirely fantasy. Whiteness is a means of enforcing a hierarchy. It is a false status. My favorite reduction for this is to point to apartheid South Africa, which, while it existed, designated persons from Japan as white. It wasn't that anyone in Japan or South Africa was unable to make the distinction in appearance or culture. It was simply a matter of applying status. With white status, Japanese businessmen could have power and agency in the society, in the courts, places of businesses, hotels, and restaurants of white South Africa. Whiteness is both socially powerful and essentially almost meaningless. This is why we must be free of it. Whiteness must be destructed and destroyed. This is our tool to stop these wars in the street. I had more, but I will summarize now. The white supremacists are in power from the executive branch to the local police. We have to acknowledge this. We have to acknowledge, if you are white like me, you have to acknowledge that we are benefiting in an evil and twisted way from it. We must confront this, and our confrontations with them have only just begun. We must have this power, this understanding under our belts to move forward.
The question revolves around, since these issues are so very important and involve so much suffering, so much danger to the entire world, and so much expense, given the importance of these issues, why are there so few people in attendance?
Okay, so that's a question I have a lot. We've been doing protest actions, and I thought after President Obama left power that people would come back in droves to the peace community. But as we saw the very first day that Trump was in power, he has so many issues that he's pushing to the forefront and putting so many people's lives at risk that there was 100,000 people here in Portland marching, for the Women's March. And then we have the immigration issue, and we have the environment and everything else that he's destroying and tearing apart. And these are things that are right in people's face. And the wars are overseas. So I tell people this: we co-sponsor with the Portland Peaceful Response Coalition pretty frequently their Friday rally, which has been going on since November of 2001, every single week on the corner of Pioneer Square. And we heard, when we first started doing it after 9/11, people were like, "Go back to Afghanistan, you communists," you know. Then after the Iraq War started going downhill, and then around 2006, people were like, "Thank you so much for being out here." And then it's kind of continued that way, lots of thumbs up. In the past couple of months, the most common comment that I've heard out on the street corner is, "We're at war?" Like, people don't seem to even realize we've been at war so long that these wars are still going on. And so that's one of the reasons we wanted to do this panel, too. I know a lot of people in this room work on a lot of other issues. So in the same way that we at PJW try to, in our big peace marches and so forth, say, hey, Palestine's connected to all this. Hey, the environment's connected to this. The economy is connected to this. Civil rights are connected to this. Civil liberties are connected to this. I want to see you, when you're working on those other issues, say, hey, let's make sure we talk about the wars when we're talking about this issue. Because the war, we can trace it all back to the wars as well, and why we don't have money to fund our social needs is because we spend so much money on war, et cetera, et cetera. And and the racism and the misogyny and all the other things that come along with our war state. So that's, I think, why fewer people are here, because people are stretched out on all these other issues. There's people speaking out and pushing back on a lot of fronts. I think that's encouraging. I think that part of Peace and Justice Works, when we got founded, we wanted to work on a local peace issue, so that's why we created Portland Cop Watch. And there was a question and discussion about the role of the police and all this. And the police, while it's true they're also infiltrated by right-wing groups, as an institution, they were created, right, basically from the history of people tracking down slaves. And it's that kind of racism, and they're using violence to enforce state power is institutionally what our society has asked police to do, and that's why we have to push back and assert our rights. And that's why Portland Cop Watch is a part of our organization as well. So I'm hoping that everybody takes that kind of an institutional look at things, as well as the looking at the individuals who commit these kinds of horrible acts.
How deep militarism is in U.S. society, and that it's there because it represents real material interests. There are powerful political and economic forces who benefit from the tensions, the actual war. And what that means is that if we are going to deal with that, we have to help ourselves develop a really substantial critique of how this system operates. And one of the things we have to do in the context of that is help make the connections.
For me, the answer really lies in coalition building and in our essential recognition that all struggle is the same struggle when it comes to working towards liberation and a sustainable world based on egalitarianism, based on beauty and truth and love, and a respect for each other and the planet we live on. And so what are we doing to build those coalitions? How are we informing each other of each other's struggles? Panel discussions like this are a huge help. How do we reach further into communities where we might not have contacts yet? How do we reach into marginalized communities? How do we reach people throughout the class divides? How do we reach out and make sure that we are all aware that our struggles are interconnected? How do we actually look at left-right culture wars? Because actually, to me, that's a real war. It includes the rise of white supremacy. It includes the war on women, where the latest wisdom from on high is that to prevent unwed motherhood, we are to engage in abstinence outside of marriage. Thanks, Trump. And what are the men doing, right? Because women apparently get pregnant by ourselves now. It's awesome, right? Parthenogenesis rocks. You know, I mean, again, we have to call out misogyny. We have to call out racism. We have to call out classism. We have to realize that our struggles are intertwined and that we have to practice solidarity like our lives depend on it, because in fact they do. And so with that, I want to, and also, you know, just want to make sure that we also include the recognition of the LGBTQIA communities, which are again under attack, the immigrant communities that are under attack, the rise in the theocracy, which is huge right now. Again, these struggles are all interconnected. And so, with that, I guess I want to ask everyone here to just go ahead and reaffirm and recommit to continue the struggle that you are doing, but also do a little bit more, because we are living with the world on fire. It's a state of emergency. And I really want to thank everyone for being here tonight and for supporting this work, and I hope to see you all again real soon as we continue this work and deepen it. Thanks.